You ever get arrested for breaking into your own house? Because that's exactly what almost happened to me at 8:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, standing barefoot on cold concrete, while two patrol cars idled in my driveway, and a woman I had never met was pointing at me like I was some kind of threat to national security. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with exhaust hung in the air, and the low hum of engines vibrated through the soles of my feet as I stared past the officers straight at my front door. Except it didn't look like my front door anymore. The brass handle had been replaced. The welcome mat was different. And the woman standing there, perfect posture, silk robe, coffee mug like she owned the zip code. She wasn't confused. She was certain. "That's him," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning stillness. "He's been circling the property for days. I think he's trying to break in." I let that hang there. Didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. Just watched as one of the officers stepped closer, hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning me like I didn't belong. Gravel crunched under his boots. Somewhere down the street, a garage door opened and closed like nothing unusual was happening. "Sir," he said, calm but firm, "we're going to need you to step away from the property." I glanced back at the house. 12,000 square feet of glass, stone, and steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting a sky so clear it almost looked fake. The kind of place people slowed down to stare at when they drive by. The kind of place that wasn't supposed to have problems like this. I exhaled slowly, catching the faint scent of citrus cleaner drifting from inside. My cleaner, my schedule, my system. Except I hadn't been home in a week. 7 days. That's all it took. 7 days for someone to decide my absence meant opportunity. 7 days for a homeowners association president with too much time and not enough authority to convince herself she was in charge of something she didn't understand. I shifted my weight, feeling the rough edge of the driveway under my heel, and finally spoke. "Officer," I said, keeping my tone even, "how long has she been living here?" That made him pause, just for a second. "Enough." Behind him, she scoffed, a tight, dismissive sound. "I don't live here," she snapped. "I'm overseeing the property. The owner left it unattended. HOA policy allows intervention if a home becomes a liability." Liability. That word sat there, heavy and absurd. This place had private security, automated systems, and more insurance coverage than half the street combined. But I nodded slightly, like I was considering it. Like maybe she had a point. Like maybe I was the one out of place. The officer looked between us, uncertainty creeping in now, subtle but real. The air shifted. Not much. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. And I was always paying attention. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't just a house. And I wasn't just some guy who showed up at the wrong address. I let my gaze drift up to the security camera mounted above the entryway, the tiny red light blinking steady, recording everything. Every word. Every assumption. Every mistake. Then I looked back at the officer, calm as ever, and said, "I think you might want to double-check who you're asking to leave." The officer's expression shifted just enough for me to see the crack form, like a hairline fracture in glass that had not shattered yet. But what if the pressure kept building? And I knew exactly how much pressure to apply because I had spent the last 15 years designing systems that broke people's assumptions without ever raising my voice. And right now, every second mattered more than any argument ever could. Because arguments could be dismissed, but documented mistakes could not be undone. And the small blinking light above the door kept recording everything with perfect clarity, time-stamped, backed up, and mirrored off-site. A habit I had built after learning the hard way that truth meant nothing if you could not prove it when it counted. The second officer stepped out of the cruiser, the door closing with a dull thud that echoed slightly against the stone facade, and he took a slower approach, scanning the property with a different kind of awareness, the kind you only got from someone who had seen enough. Situations go sideways to know when something did not add up, and I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on the security system panel near the entrance, the high-end cameras, the biometric lock that had been forcibly overridden and replaced with something cheaper, temporary, and completely unauthorized. "Sir," the first officer said again, a little less certain this time. "Do you have any identification on you?" I nodded and reached slowly into my back pocket, careful, deliberate, pulling out a slim leather wallet that still smelled faintly of cedar from the drawer it had sat in before I left town, and I handed him my driver's license without saying a word, letting him read the name, the address, the exact address we were all standing in front of, and I watched as his eyes flicked from the card to the house, and then back to me, confusion tightening his jaw. Behind him, she laughed, a short, dismissive sound that carried just enough arrogance to make it clear she believed she had already won. "That does not prove anything," she said, stepping forward slightly, her slippers brushing against the stone like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. "People forge documents all the time. The homeowner authorized the association to manage the property while he was away. I have paperwork." Paperwork. That word again, thrown around like it carried weight, like it could override everything else. And I almost smiled because this was exactly the kind of small, ridiculous justification that led to catastrophic consequences when the wrong person pushed it too far. "Then show it," the second officer said, his tone neutral but sharper now, and she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before turning and walking inside without inviting anyone, as if that alone proved her authority, and the door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. The first officer handed my license back, slower this time, studying my face like he was trying to reconcile two conflicting realities, and I could see the moment he realized something was off. Not wrong enough to act yet, but wrong enough to question. "You said you have been away for a week," he asked. 7 days, I replied, glancing at the driveway where my car had been parked before I left, now replaced by a different vehicle, one I did not recognize, sitting slightly crooked like it had been moved in a hurry. 7 days was all it took for someone to mistake absence for weakness, for a minor HOA clause about property oversight to be twisted into unauthorized occupation, for a woman with a title but no real authority to cross a line she did not even know existed. The door opened again, and she stepped out holding a thin folder, confidence restored, chin lifted, ready to present whatever document she thought justified this. And as she extended it toward the officer, I noticed the letterhead, the logo, the formatting, all familiar in a way she could not possibly understand. Because I had approved that template myself 2 years ago when I acquired the management company that serviced this entire district. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. I just watched as the officer took the paper, scanning it, his brow tightening, and I let the silence stretch, because silence, when timed correctly, could be louder than any accusation, and this silence was about to cost her more than she could imagine. The officer's eyes moved line by line across the document, slower now, more deliberate, like he was no longer just reading but actually processing, and I could see the moment the first inconsistency hit him, because his thumb stopped tapping against the edge of the paper, a small unconscious habit that suddenly froze mid-motion. And that was when I knew the shift had begun, subtle but irreversible, because once doubt enters, authority starts to crumble from the inside out. She stood there with her arms crossed, watching him like she expected validation, like this was just a formality before I would be escorted off my own property. And for a second, I almost admired the confidence, because it takes a certain kind of person to stand on someone else's foundation and believe it belongs to you. "Ma'am," the officer said carefully, "this document states temporary oversight for exterior maintenance and security checks, not residential occupation." Her expression tightened, but only for a fraction of a second before she recovered, stepping closer, pointing at a paragraph halfway down the page. "Right there," she said, her voice sharper now, a little more forceful. "It says intervention is permitted if the property is considered at risk. An empty house in this neighborhood is a risk." I acted accordingly. I tilted my head slightly, letting the words settle, because that single sentence, that interpretation, was exactly the kind of small, unreasonable leap that could trigger consequences far beyond what she imagined. And I had seen it happen before, people stretching minor authority into major decisions without realizing the scale of what they were interfering with. The second officer leaned in, reading over his partner's shoulder, and I noticed the way his brow furrowed deeper, the way his stance shifted just enough to signal he was no longer siding with assumption but with evidence. "There is nothing here about you replacing locks or occupying the residence," he said, his tone firmer now, less neutral, more grounded. She exhaled sharply, frustration creeping in, but she was not backing down, not yet. "I did what was necessary," she insisted. "Someone has to enforce standards around here." Standards. Another word she used like a shield, like it justified everything. and I let out a slow breath, feeling the morning air cool against my skin, grounding myself in the moment, because this was the exact point where most people would argue, raise their voice, try to prove ownership with emotion, but I had learned a long time ago that emotion never wins against structured reality. I took a small step toward the driveway, glancing briefly at the utility box near the edge of the property, the one she had probably never even noticed, and I could almost see the chain reaction waiting to happen, not because I wanted it to, but because she had already set it in motion the moment she crossed that line. "Officer," I said calmly, "would you mind asking her when she filed the occupancy notice?" That question landed differently, heavier, because it was specific, procedural, and impossible to bluff without consequence. She blinked. Just once, a microsecond of hesitation that most people would miss, but the officers did not. It was processed through the association," she replied, her voice losing a fraction of its certainty. "That is not what I asked," I said, still calm, still even. "What date?" Silence stretched again, thicker this time, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness just long enough to make the tension feel real, tangible, like pressure building before a storm. The officer lowered the document slightly, looking directly at her now, waiting, and I could see it clearly, the exact moment her confidence stopped being solid and started becoming fragile, because she did not have an answer, not a real one, not one that would hold up once the system behind that document was actually checked. I glanced once more at the camera above the door, the quiet witness to all of this, and then back at her, because what she still did not understand, what she had not even begun to consider, was that this was never just about a house or a week of unauthorized occupancy. This was about systems, contracts, and control, and she had just interfered with something that extended far beyond a single property line, something that connected every home on this street in ways she could not see. And when that system corrected itself, it was not going to be a small correction, it was going to be a collapse. She opened her mouth again, ready to push back, but nothing came out this time, just a shallow breath and a flicker of uncertainty that she could not hide anymore. And the second officer noticed it too, because his posture changed, shoulders squaring slightly as he shifted from passive observer to active evaluator. And that shift was everything, because authority only holds as long as people believe in it. And right now belief was slipping through her fingers faster than she could recover it. The document in the officer's hand rustled lightly as a breeze passed through the driveway, carrying the faint scent of asphalt warming under the rising sun. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the entire street was holding its breath waiting to see who would break first. "Ma'am," the officer said, more direct now, "if you cannot provide a clear date or authorization for occupancy, this becomes a different situation." She straightened, defensive instinct kicking in, her voice rising just enough to try to regain control. "I told you, the association approved it. We have procedures. This man has been gone." The property was vulnerable. Vulnerable. That word echoed in my head, and I almost let out a quiet laugh, because if there was one thing this property had never been, it was vulnerable, not with the infrastructure beneath it, not with the contracts tied to it, not with the systems that ran silently in the background connecting every home on this block to a network most people never even realized existed. I took a slow step toward the edge of the driveway again, letting my eyes drift once more to the utility access panel half hidden behind a trimmed hedge, the one that looked ordinary but controlled something far more significant than landscaping lights or irrigation. "Officer," I said calmly, "would you mind checking the service registry tied to this address?" The first officer frowned slightly. "Service registry?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Every authorized occupancy triggers a service status update, especially in managed communities like this. Water, energy, security protocols, all of it is logged. If she has authorization, it will be there." That landed heavier than anything I had said before, because it was not opinion. It was verifiable, and verifiable meant unavoidable. The second officer pulled out his radio, stepping a few feet away as he spoke quietly into it, requesting confirmation, and the sound of static filled the air for a moment, sharp and mechanical against the otherwise quiet morning. She shifted her weight, arms tightening across her chest, eyes darting briefly toward the house, and then back to the officers, and I could see it clearly now. The confidence was gone, replaced by calculation, by the realization that whatever she had relied on before was not enough anymore. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice tighter now, less controlled. "We handle these things internally. There is no need to escalate." Escalate. Another word chosen carefully, but it was too late for that, because escalation had already begun the moment she replaced those locks, the moment she stepped inside and claimed space that was never hers to claim. The radio crackled again, and the officer nodded as he listened, his expression shifting in real time, confusion first, then focus, then something sharper, something that looked a lot like concern. "Copy that," he said quietly before lowering the radio and turning back toward us. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before, like the air itself had thickened, and I could hear the faint hum of the house systems behind the walls, steady, controlled, waiting. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "there is no record of any authorized occupancy change for this property. In fact, the system shows the residence as actively secured under owner control the entire time." Her face drained just enough to be noticeable, a subtle shift that confirmed everything without her saying a word, and she opened her mouth again. But this time there was no confidence behind it, just the beginning of an explanation that even she seemed unsure of. I finally stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to make it clear I was no longer on the outside of this situation. "You said the property was vulnerable," I said quietly, meeting her eyes for the first time since this started, and for a brief second she looked away. "What you did was not oversight. It was interference." The word hung there, precise, intentional, because interference carried consequences far beyond misunderstanding, and she knew it now, even if she did not fully understand how far those consequences would reach. I glanced once more at the camera, then back at the officers, because the next part was not about proving who owned the house anymore. That part was already settled. This was about what happens when someone crosses into a system they do not control and triggers mechanisms they cannot stop. And somewhere beneath our feet, quietly and without warning, those mechanisms had already begun to respond. The second officer's radio was still in his hand when a faint vibration ran through it again, not the loud crackle from before, but a softer follow-up transmission, and the way his eyes narrowed as he listened told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke, because whatever confirmation he had just received did not just support my side, it expanded it into something far bigger than either of them expected to be dealing with on a quiet Tuesday morning. "Dispatch is flagging this address," he said slowly, glancing at his partner, "not just as a residential property, but as part of a managed infrastructure grid with restricted override protocols." The words landed heavy, technical, and unfamiliar to her, and I watched as confusion replaced what little certainty she had left, because she did not understand what that meant, but she could feel that it was not in her favor. "That does not make any sense," she said quickly, her voice rising again, trying to reclaim control through volume instead of authority. "This is a private home. The association has jurisdiction." Jurisdiction. She kept reaching for bigger words, but each one only made the gap between her understanding and reality more obvious. I shifted my stance slightly, letting my gaze move toward the street beyond the driveway, where a few neighbors had begun to slow their morning routines, subtle glances, curtains shifting, the quiet curiosity that always follows the presence of police vehicles in a place that prides itself on perfection. "Officer," I said, keeping my tone even, "you might want to ask dispatch who manages that grid." The second officer lifted the radio again without hesitation this time, repeating the request, and the response came faster, clearer, like whoever was on the other end had already anticipated the question. There was a pause, then a single name came through, followed by a company designation, and I saw the exact moment it connected for him, because his posture changed completely, shoulders straightening, stance resetting, as if the situation had just been reclassified in his mind from a neighborhood dispute to something with corporate and legal weight behind it. He looked at me differently now, not with suspicion, but with recognition, the kind that comes when pieces fall into place all at once. "Sir," he said carefully, "dispatch is asking if you are associated with that entity." I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the shift undeniable, to let her feel it too, because this was the point where the balance of power did not just tip, it flipped entirely. The morning air felt sharper now, the light brighter, every detail more defined as the moment settled into place. "I am that entity," I said simply. No raised voice, no emphasis, just a statement, clean and undeniable. The effect was immediate. The first officer exhaled slowly, his expression shifting from uncertainty to clarity, while the second gave a small nod, like a final confirmation had just been checked off in his mind. Behind them, she froze, completely still for a fraction of a second that felt longer than anything that had happened so far, because in that moment, everything she thought she controlled unraveled at once. "That is not possible," she said, but the words lacked conviction now, sounding more like a reflex than a belief. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the property, the street, the quiet network beneath it all that she had never considered. Every water line, every power routing agreement, every security integration on this block is tied into a system my company manages, I said calmly. This house is not just connected to it. It is the control point. The officers exchanged a quick glance, the kind that did not need words, because they both understood now that this was no longer about trespassing or misunderstanding. This was about unauthorized interference with a managed system that affected far more than one address. She took a step back without realizing it, her heel catching slightly against the edge of the stone, her composure slipping in ways she could not hide anymore. "I was protecting the neighborhood," she said, softer now, like she was trying to rewrite the narrative in real time. I shook my head once, slow and deliberate. "No," I replied. "You made a decision based on a minor assumption and turned it into a major action without verifying authority." I let that settle, then added, "And now the system is responding to that action." Because that was the part she still did not fully understand, the part none of them could see yet, but it was already happening, quietly, automatically, exactly as it was designed to do. And when it finished correcting itself, the consequences were not going to stop at this driveway. The moment the words left my mouth, I could feel the entire situation recalibrate, not loudly, not dramatically, but with that quiet, irreversible shift that happens when reality finally replaces assumption. And the difference was immediate, because now they were no longer trying to figure out if I belonged there. They were trying to understand what exactly they had stepped into. The second officer cleared his throat slightly, adjusting his stance, his attention no longer split between two sides, but focused, precise, like he was mentally filing this under something far more serious than a neighborhood dispute. "Sir," he said, measured and respectful now, "dispatch is requesting confirmation on system status, specifically whether there has been any unauthorized interference." I nodded once, already knowing the answer before he even finished the sentence, because the system did not wait for permission to react. It responded the moment thresholds were crossed, and those thresholds had been crossed the second she replaced those locks and occupied the structure without authorization. "There has," I said calmly, "and the system has already logged it." Behind him, she let out a small, incredulous laugh, but it sounded hollow now, like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. "This is ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "You are talking about this like it is some kind of corporate network. It is a house." I turned my head slightly, looking at her, not with frustration, not with anger, but with a kind of clarity that made the gap between us impossible to ignore. "It is not just a house," I replied. "It is a node." The word hung there, unfamiliar to her, but heavy with meaning, and I could see the officers register it differently, because they had already heard enough from dispatch to know. This was not ordinary. The first officer shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the street where more movement had begun, a few neighbors now standing outside, pretending to check their mail or adjust their landscaping, while clearly watching every second of this unfold. The neighborhood that prided itself on control and order was starting to feel the edges of something it could not manage. "What happens when there is interference?" the second officer asked, his voice lower now, more cautious. I exhaled slowly, letting the answer come without urgency, because urgency was not needed. The process was already in motion. "The system isolates the affected node," I said. "It prevents further unauthorized access, flags all associated accounts, and triggers a compliance review across the entire grid." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, more complex, because now it was not just about one person's mistake. It was about the ripple effect of that mistake, the kind that spreads through connected systems whether people understand them or not. She frowned, confusion deepening, her eyes flicking between me and the officers as if trying to find something solid to hold on to. Compliance review? She repeated. What does that even mean? I glanced briefly toward the utility panel again, then back at her. It means every property tied to this network is about to be audited for access violations, contract compliance, and authorization integrity, I said. Automatically. The word landed like a weight, because automatic meant unstoppable, and unstoppable meant there was no quick fix, no simple apology that could rewind what had already been triggered. The second officer's radio crackled again, and this time the tone was sharper, more urgent, and he listened closely, his expression tightening with each passing second before he finally responded with a quiet acknowledgement. When he lowered the radio, there was no hesitation in his voice. Sir, he said, dispatch confirms that multiple service flags have already been issued across the neighborhood, including temporary restrictions pending review. I could hear it then, faint but unmistakable, the distant hum of systems adjusting, not loud enough for most people to notice, but once you knew what to listen for, it was impossible to ignore, like the low vibration of something powerful shifting beneath the surface. Down the street, a garage door that had been halfway open stopped abruptly, then reversed, closing completely, and a few houses away, exterior lights flickered once before stabilizing, subtle signs that the network was reconfiguring itself in real time. She turned toward the street, eyes widening slightly as she began to notice it too, the small, controlled disruptions that did not look like chaos but felt like control being taken away piece by piece. What is happening? She asked, her voice no longer sharp, no longer confident, just uncertain. I met her gaze, calm as ever. The system is protecting itself, I said. And what she still did not fully understand was that in a network like this, protecting the system always came before protecting the people who thought they controlled it. The change did not arrive like chaos. It arrived like precision, quiet and controlled. And that was what made it so unsettling, because nothing was breaking, nothing was crashing, everything was simply adjusting, and those adjustments were happening faster than anyone on this street could understand. The officer's radio lit up again, this time with overlapping voices, short bursts of updates coming in from dispatch about multiple addresses reporting restricted access, flagged accounts, and temporary service holds pending verification, and I could see the shift ripple outward in real time as doors that had been open moments ago were now closing, garage panels lowering, exterior systems locking into standby modes, not failing, just tightening, like a network pulling itself inward to protect its core. This is spreading, the first officer said under his breath, scanning the street, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to concern, because this was no longer contained to a single driveway. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the neighborhood that had always responded to her direction, always followed her notices, her fines, her enforcement letters, and for the first time it was not responding to her at all. It was responding to something else entirely. You need to stop this, she said, her voice breaking through the tension, not commanding anymore, not authoritative, but urgent, almost pleading. I met her gaze without moving. It is not something I can stop, I replied. It is something that resolves. The difference mattered, because stopping implied control, and resolution implied process, and process does not negotiate once it begins. The second officer stepped a little closer to me, lowering his voice. Sir, dispatch is saying compliance teams are being notified. They are talking about contract breaches across multiple properties. I nodded once, because that was exactly what would happen when unauthorized access triggered a system-wide review. Every agreement, every service contract, every compliance clause tied to this network would be pulled, analyzed, and verified. And in a neighborhood like this, where convenience had quietly replaced awareness, there were always inconsistencies waiting to be exposed. Down the street, a man in a pressed shirt stood beside his driveway, staring at his phone with a confused expression, tapping the screen repeatedly as if it would fix whatever message he was seeing, and across from him, a delivery vehicle slowed, then stopped entirely before reversing out of the block, rerouted by a system that no longer recognized the area as fully authorized for service. Small things, individually insignificant, but together they formed a pattern, a tightening loop that was closing around the entire neighborhood. "This is because of her?" the first officer asked, glancing between us, trying to connect the scale of what he was witnessing to the origin of it. I did not rush the answer. "This started because of a single unauthorized decision," I said. "The system does not recognize intent. It recognizes actions." She shook her head, stepping forward again, desperation now replacing every trace of control she had earlier. "I was trying to maintain standards," she said, her voice unsteady. "That is my responsibility." I watched her for a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of detached clarity, because this was the inevitable point where intention collides with consequence, and consequence does not adjust itself to match what someone meant to do. "Standards without authority are just assumptions," I said quietly. "And assumptions do not hold up inside a system like this." The officer's radio crackled again, louder this time, and he turned slightly to listen, his expression tightening as new information came through. Something about temporary financial holds linked to service agreements, something about automated audits triggering penalty clauses, and even without hearing every word, I knew exactly what it meant, because the infrastructure was not just technical, it was contractual, layered with protections designed to enforce compliance at scale, and when those protections activated, they did not just inconvenience people, they created consequences measured in real numbers, real costs, real impact. She looked at me again, eyes wide now, the reality finally catching up to her. "What have you done?" she asked, barely above a whisper. I did not raise my voice. I did not move. "I did not do this," I said. "I built something that responds when it is interfered with." And as the quiet adjustments continued around us, as the neighborhood slowly realized that control had shifted beyond anything they could influence, the true scale of that response was only just beginning to surface. The first official vehicle arrived without sirens, a dark sedan with discreet markings that most people would not recognize, but the officers did immediately, stepping back slightly as two individuals in tailored suits stepped out, their expressions neutral but focused, the kind of presence that did not need to announce authority because it carried it quietly and absolutely. One of them glanced at the tablet in his hand, then at the houses lining the street, as if overlaying a digital map onto the real world, confirming something already calculated long before they arrived. "We are here regarding a network-wide compliance escalation," he said calmly, his voice steady and controlled, addressing the officers first before his gaze shifted toward me, pausing for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement that told me the system had already identified its origin point. The woman who had started all of this stepped forward quickly, her composure now completely fractured. "Finally," she said, her voice rising with relief, mistaking their arrival for validation. "You need to remove him. He does not belong here. He is the reason everything is malfunctioning." The man did not react to her accusation, did not even look at her immediately, instead scrolling through data, verifying entries, cross-checking authorizations, the kind of process that ignored emotion entirely. "Ma'am," he said after a moment, still not meeting her eyes. "This escalation was triggered by unauthorized occupation of a restricted property tied to a protected infrastructure network." The words landed slowly, but their meaning spread instantly, shifting the balance of the entire situation. "That is not possible," she replied quickly, her voice tightening. "I authorized everything. I am the head of the homeowners association." The second suited individual finally looked at her, and there was no hostility in his expression, only clarity. "Your authorization does not extend to this property," he said, "nor does it extend to any asset linked to the infrastructure layer associated with it." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because this was no longer a disagreement. It was a statement of fact backed by systems that did not negotiate. The first officer glanced at me again, now fully aware that the situation had moved far beyond anything local enforcement could resolve. "Sir," he said quietly, "are you connected to this network?" I did not answer immediately, because the answer was already unfolding in front of them. The man with the tablet turned it slightly, enough for the officers to see a portion of the screen, lines of data, ownership structures, layered entities that stretched far beyond a single home or even a single neighborhood. "Primary ownership traces back through a series of holding entities," he explained, his tone clinical, precise. Final control rests with a private infrastructure group that manages utility integration, access systems, and compliance frameworks across multiple regions. He paused, then looked directly at me. Verification confirms you are the principal authority. That was the moment everything shifted completely, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with understanding, because authority had just been redefined in a way none of them could challenge. She stared at me, her expression frozen between disbelief and realization. "That is not true," she said softly, but there was no conviction left in her voice. I held her gaze, calm, unchanged. "You enforced rules on something you did not understand," I said evenly. And the system responded exactly as it was designed to. Behind us, more notifications began to ripple through the neighborhood, not louder, but more severe: financial alerts, contract suspensions, compliance audits escalating from warnings to active enforcement. Because once the infrastructure layer was engaged, it did not isolate a single violation, it evaluated everything connected to it. The second-suited individual turned back to the officers. "This area is now under active review," he said. "All associated agreements will be audited. Temporary restrictions will remain in place until verification is complete." The officer nodded slowly, absorbing the scale of what that meant, because this was no longer about access to a house. It was about every contract, every service, every financial tie linked to this network being examined at once. She took a step back, her confidence completely gone now, replaced by the weight of consequences she had never imagined. "You cannot do this to an entire neighborhood," she said, her voice barely steady. I did not raise my voice. "It was never about the neighborhood," I replied. "It was about a single decision that triggered a system built to protect everything connected to it." And as the quiet enforcement continued to spread, as the cost of that single decision began to surface in ways measured not in inconvenience, but in real, escalating impact, it became clear to everyone standing there that this was no longer a situation anyone could undo, only something they would have to face as it fully unfolded. By the time the sun dipped lower over the quiet rooftops, the neighborhood no longer felt like the place it had been that morning, not because anything visible had been destroyed, but because everything invisible had been redefined, and that shift carried a weight far heavier than anything physical ever could. The suited officials remained composed, continuing their methodical work as more data streamed across their devices, confirming what had already begun, expanding the scope of the audit beyond a single incident into a full structural review that reached into every contract, every agreement, every assumption that had once held this community together. The officers had stepped back completely now, no longer participants, just witnesses to a process that had outgrown their authority, their earlier presence reduced to quiet observation as reality unfolded layer by layer. She stood near the edge of the driveway, no longer speaking, no longer directing, her posture smaller, as if the invisible pressure of consequence had finally settled around her, pressing in from all sides. Around us, subtle but unmistakable signs continued to emerge, residents receiving formal notices on their phones, alerts that were no longer warnings but active enforcement steps, temporary freezes on shared amenities, escalations tied to compliance clauses buried deep within agreements no one had read carefully enough until now. A man down the street paced slowly, speaking urgently into his phone about a flagged account that had suddenly halted a pending transaction worth more than he was prepared to lose, while another neighbor stood frozen beside her mailbox, staring at a notification that clearly carried implications she did not yet fully understand. These were not random disruptions. They were precise, calculated consequences unfolding exactly as designed, each one tied back to the same origin point, the same unauthorized action that had set everything into motion. "Is there any way to stop the review?" one of the officers finally asked, his voice low, almost cautious, as if he already suspected the answer. I looked at him briefly, then back at the street. "Systems like this are not stopped," I said. "They complete their process." The distinction settled over the scene like a final confirmation, because completion meant there would be an outcome, and outcomes carried weight that could not be negotiated away. The lead official stepped closer to her then, his tone still calm, but now unmistakably final. You will be formally notified regarding liability associated with unauthorized occupancy and interference with protected infrastructure, he said. Preliminary estimates indicate financial exposure extending into multiple categories, including breach penalties, system disruption costs, and secondary contractual impacts across associated properties. He did not need to state a number, because the scale was already clear. This was not a fine, not a simple correction. This was a cascading financial consequence that would stretch far beyond anything she had anticipated when she made that first decision. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to assert, only the reality of what had been triggered. I took a slow breath, not out of relief, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition that the process had reached its final stage, the point where everything that had been set in motion would now resolve on its own terms. This neighborhood will stabilize, I said quietly, not to her, not to the officers, but to the moment itself. But it will not return to what it was. The statement lingered, because everyone understood what it meant. Stability would come at a cost, and that cost would reshape the very structure of this place, financially, legally, and socially. The second official nodded once, as if acknowledging that outcome had already been calculated. Systems will recalibrate once compliance is restored, he said. Until then, enforcement will continue. And just like that, the final piece settled into place. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with certainty, because the illusion of control that had once defined this street had been replaced by something far more absolute, something that did not respond to authority claimed, only authority proven. She lowered her gaze, her earlier certainty completely gone, replaced by the quiet realization that a single, seemingly minor decision had expanded into consequences measured not just in dollars, but in the collapse of everything she believed she controlled. I turned toward the house, the doors unlocking smoothly as I approached, responding as they always had, unchanged, because for me, nothing had shifted at all. The system had simply done what it was built to do. And as I stepped inside, leaving the street to face the full weight of what had been set into motion, the silence behind me carried a new meaning, not empty, but resolved. The kind of silence that only comes after everything has been decided.